Welcome to the LBF Church podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him in the ways that he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and what I want to talk about in this episode relates to the pro-life position, so it relates to the debate about abortion, and specifically relates to the question, is the pro-life position inconsistent? For example, is it inconsistent for us to be pro-life when it comes to abortion, but to be pro-death penalty, or to not be pacifists, or to be in favor of people being able to have the right to bear arms, even though they might use those guns to kill another person? So the question just derives the whole idea, if we are pro-life, what does that mean for issues across the board and not just related to abortion? And there's two reasons why I want to talk about this. The first reason is because just the topic itself is something that's important for us to think about. But secondly, because I think as we reason through this issue, it's actually a good example for how we think about things and how we come to different conclusions on things and try to see the connections in our faith. So I'll walk through the question, but then I'll try to move back in kind of a layered way. So just on the surface, the question, is there an inconsistency to the pro-life position? And what I want to say, first of all, is I think part of the problem that comes around with this question is the terms that we use. So when it comes to abortion, we typically break up into the camps pro-life and pro-choice. And pro-life people will say, no, it's not permissible to have an abortion because that's the life of a child and you're killing that child. And the pro-choice position will be that, no, the woman should be able to have the choice to be able to abort the baby in the womb because it's her body or because she needs to have some kind of bodily autonomy. Now, I will acknowledge pro-life is probably not the best term to use regarding this position. It certainly is not as bad as the term pro-choice, because some people will say, well, you're not pro-life if you aren't against the death penalty, or if you're not pro-life if you believe that the military is an okay thing, or you're not pro-life if you own a gun, because ultimately you're just selectively pro-life. And in a sense, that's true. And I would argue that from a biblical basis, there's not an across-the-board mandate that killing is never permissible. I'll argue a little bit about that in a bit. But I would say, all right, there is an inconsistency there. There certainly, though, is a wild inconsistency in saying that you're pro-choice, because nobody is in favor of any choice that people should be free to make. None of us are in favor of a man being able to have the choice about whether or not to hit or to rape a woman. We are not in favor of another woman having the choice of whether or not she shoots another woman. We are not in favor of ultimate choice. And so I'd say, all right, fair enough that there's not a total consistency in the pro-life position, if put that way. Maybe we should just acknowledge what we're really talking about is that we're pro-life when it comes to abortion and we're pro-choice when it comes to abortion. So that said, I'm not necessarily in favor of saying we should use different terms. I just think we should both give each other the courtesy of saying, all right, I understand what we're talking about when we use these terms. We're not talking about being ultimately pro-choice in every circumstance. We're not talking about being ultimately pro-life in every circumstance. And so maybe the bigger question when we get into whether or not there's an inconsistency here is the question, if we are pro-life when it comes to unborn babies, do we need to be pro-life on questions related to war, capital punishment, self-defense, and end-of-life issues? And so as we delve into that, that's when we do turn to the scriptures and say, all right, what do we learn from this? What do we gain from this when it comes to some of these other things? And if we were to look in the Old Testament, some people will run straight towards the thou shalt not kill, which if you delve into the actual Hebrew wording of that, there is a different word for thou shalt not murder, which is really what the command says, and thou shalt not kill. And that makes a lot of sense because if you read through the Old Testament, you see lots of cases where people are killing, and in warfare situations or in capital punishment situations, and sometimes directly ordered by God to do so. So the Old Testament does not present us with the idea that it is always wrong for any of God's people to take somebody else's life. Clearly, there's different circumstances. Now, so that gets into a little bit of the death penalty, that gets into a little bit of warfare. So if we look at the Old Testament, that's what we would come up with. And so then you got to ask the question, all right, once we get to the New Testament, have we entered into some new age? Where in the past, it was permissible for God's people to be involved in these sorts of things. But when we get to the New Testament, Jesus is talking about not taking your own revenge. Jesus is talking about loving your enemy. He's talking about things that maybe lead us to the conclusions that Christians should never be involved in taking a life, even if in self-defense. And what I want to say just from the kind of question of consistency is there probably are some people who would go all the way towards saying, even in a life or death situation, it is not permissible for a Christian to take somebody else's life. So even if, again, the classic example, somebody breaks into your house and is attacking you or is threatening your family, not permissible to take their life. Maybe you're able to use non-lethal force, but certainly not able to take their life. If you got a hostage situation and you've got the sniper up on the roof and he's looking down because somebody has a hostage and he's holding a gun to somebody's head, is it permissible at that point for the sniper to take the guy out in order to save other people? If you're going to go to all of those extreme situations, which some acknowledgedly are extreme situations and pretty rare, but other ones are real situations that happen, and real life or death moments that police officers and military officials deal with, and sometimes private citizens also. If you're going to go all the way and say, nope, I'm pro-life across the board, it's never permissible to take another human being's life, I would say, okay, I don't think that that's where Scripture leads us. I don't think that that's where Scripture mandates us. But from that standpoint, you could say that you're consistent on that. What I would say instead is that Scripture leads us to the conclusion that not all killing is exactly evil, and not all killing is even immoral. There are some times that killing is either the result of a bad situation that you find yourself in, or actually is the best way that you can love your neighbor by protecting them from a murderous person or somebody who's going to do them harm. In fact, the entire biblical basis for the death penalty really goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 9, which I'll read right here. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, this is after the flood, and God is setting things up for Noah and his family. And in verse 6, he says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind." And so you can see there the reasoning. The reasoning is, the reason you would put somebody to death for murder is because of how much you prize the human being that they murdered, which is strange because some people nowadays would say, because you value human life so much, you wouldn't take it through the death penalty. The reasoning in Genesis chapter 9 is the reason you would take life in a capital punishment situation is because you so value human life that when that is violated, that is an affront not only to the person who was killed, but that is an affront to God as the one who created them in his image. So that's a little bit of the setting for that. And so then you got to ask the question of saying, all right, if we're getting away from sort of the pro-life terminology in terms of it's always wrong to take a life, then we've just got to take the situation, the morality of the situation on a case-by-case basis. And from that standpoint, you'd say, all right, there is no inconsistency towards saying, on the one hand, it is wrong and immoral to murder an unborn child in the womb. And at the same time to say it is permissible for society sometimes to execute and to put to death people who have committed murderous, horrible acts. There's no inconsistency between those two. It's totally fine to hold both of those the same and to say, I hold one and then I hold the other. So there's not an inconsistency here. But then we got to ask kind of the deeper question and say, how is it that those of us who are Christians who hold to a pro-life position when it comes to abortion, how is it that we arrived at that position? And why is it that we see that as an important position? And I would say there's probably two key reasons and two key biblical teachings that drive us towards that belief that abortion is wrong and that the unborn child is worthy of protection. Number one would be just the value of human life, that we are human beings created in the image of God, and that means something significant. And the second would be the whole idea, the biblical concept of protecting the most vulnerable. So we start with the belief, and I'm not going to get way into the science of all of this. There are lots of great YouTube videos, there are great sermons, there are great resources and books that kind of walk through the medical side of things. Interestingly enough, I'll just say, I think the debate has largely shifted in our country from is it a baby, is it not a baby from a medical standpoint? Because as medical technology gets better and better, we see the unborn baby in a way that makes it hard to deny that that's a real person there. So most of the debate has moved away from the idea of it's not a person and moved much towards the idea of female bodily autonomy, or the idea that we should be able to, we shouldn't have to bear the weight of bad decisions that we made and the consequences of those, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So when we come back to this, I'm not going to make this deep argument that the unborn child is a person. I believe the unborn child is a person. I believe that Scripture bears that out through passages like Psalm 139 about God knitting us together in our mother's womb, about the idea that John the Baptist is leaping in the womb when the unborn Jesus comes into the room. So passages like that, I think, really do lead us to the conclusion this is a real person and a person worthy of protection. And the reason that person is worthy of protection is because human beings are created in the image of God. So even at the very beginning, we hold precious that human life. That's why even if you are in favor or are a supporter of sometimes the use of the death penalty, that should be something that we take with grave seriousness. Any kind of killing should be something that we take with grave seriousness because human beings are created in God's image, even human beings who have done horrible, atrocious, violent acts. So we treasure the sanctity of human life because human beings are created in God's image. And then the other side of this is that we treasure those who are most vulnerable. And I talked about this. If you watch the podcast episodes that we did on the subject of justice, one of the things that I tried to talk about in one of the episodes was the whole idea that God takes up the cause of those who are in vulnerable situations. God takes up the cause of the widow and the orphan, not because he loves the widow and the orphan more than he loves the married person or the person that has two parents living in the home, but because those people are vulnerable and they need somebody to take up their cause. Now, when you think about the different groups in society, I would argue you can't come up with a group of people more vulnerable than unborn children. They are more vulnerable than people who experience some kind of prejudice because of either racism or because of some kind of socioeconomic issue. Those people at least have the ability to attempt to protect themselves, to advocate for themselves, to organize, to protest, to vote, to do all kinds of things like that. An unborn child doesn't have the ability to do any of those. In fact, the unborn child is largely unseen, even from a physical standpoint, which is one of the reasons why it's so easy for us to just dispose of unborn children. The unborn are amongst the most vulnerable. So when we as believers in Jesus Christ think of God's calling for us to fulfill what Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 25 about caring for the least of these, it would be hard to have any kind of discussion of that without including unborn babies in that group that we would categorize as the least of these. So if that's what leads us to this, then for us, the better question than asking, is it ever okay to kill, would be, what other implications come from the idea that, number one, we believe all human beings are created in the image of God, and number two, we believe that the most vulnerable among us are worthy of protection. Now, here's where I'll get into one more point of consistency, and then I'll talk about some practical things that I think we can do in response to how we think about this. So the first thing I'll say is that sometimes people who are pro-life or who advocate for the care and for the lives of unborn children, that there can be an argument of inconsistency to say, well, you care about this, but you don't care about these other social issues. And I'd say, well, sometimes that's probably true, sometimes that's probably not true. But for example, to say, hey, you care about unborn babies, but you don't care about the poor. You care about unborn babies, but you don't care about single mothers. You care about unborn babies, but you don't care about racial minorities. And once again, I'd say, well, maybe sometimes that's true, but I think it's worth just pointing out there is a consistency on these issues. We believe that unborn babies should not be killed. We also believe that poor people should not be killed. We also believe that racial minorities should not be killed. We also believe that single mothers should not be killed. We also believe that homeless people should not be killed. So again, just from the standpoint here, what we're not saying is we believe in extraordinary rights and privileges for unborn children. What we are saying is that we believe in the right of those people not to be killed, not to be murdered. We also believe that about all of these other groups of people. So there's no inconsistency there. If I say on the one hand, I believe an unborn baby should be protected, and on the other hand, if I'm skeptical about a certain government program in order to care for the homeless or care for the poor because I think that it's not going to be effective or I think it's unjust for some reason, there's no inconsistency there. But what I do want to say is there's a danger that I think can come to those of us who are pro-life when it comes to the subject of abortion. And the danger is this. in order to hold a pro-life position, what we are basically saying is that we believe something bad shouldn't be done. And even though there are some times where that's not easy for us to say out loud because it's a countercultural sort of position to hold, at the same time, it doesn't necessarily cost us a lot. We haven't necessarily done something really morally beneficial by saying we believe that this evil thing should not happen. We believe that this evil thing should not be legal. We believe that this evil thing should not be celebrated. We believe that this evil thing should not be sort of winked at in any way. We believe that this is something that's evil. All right, that's fine for us to say that, but we haven't necessarily accomplished anything. We haven't necessarily given any deep care for the least of these. So what I'd say is, all right, well, first of all, if we really do believe that these people are worthy of our care, then it does bring up the second question to say, well, what are we doing actively? And no doubt, probably some of you who are listening to this are doing some things actively beyond using your voice. And I don't want to diminish using your voice. Teach these values to your children. Teach the value of unborn children to the people around you. Talk about it in your small group. Talk about it with your neighbors. Talk about it with your spouse. Do all of those things. But then we can at least say, all right, well, what can I do to support a ministry like a Sure Pregnancy Clinic? What can I do in order to support people that are on the front lines? What can I do in order to promote adoption? What can I do in order to raise awareness about these things? What can I do in order to actually sort of on the ground, since abortion is currently legal in our culture, what can I do to help facilitate babies being saved? Because again, I always think of facing the people that are most impacted by this. And if we were facing a whole bunch of children who had been killed because of abortion, and all we had to say was, well, I personally was against this happening to you, that's not nothing, but that certainly is not all that we can be doing. So I think with abortion and with these other issues, we have to think beyond just the passive sense of saying, I don't think that this should be done, and saying, what am I doing actively? But I'll give something else that I also think is important for consistency on this issue. Part of the reason why we are against abortion as pro-life people is because we believe that children are a gift from God. The reason why abortion is so rampant in our culture is not simply because people think abortion is something that's wonderful. Even most people who are pro-choice still think abortion is sort of an unfortunate aspect of society and that the less abortions, the better. If that's the case, then we do have to look at the situation and say, why is this happening? And typically this is happening because people find children intensely inconvenient. And in fact, I'll even share this because this to me was a story that acknowledged both the inconvenience of children and the value of children. So I worked with this gal a bunch of years ago, and she was newly married, and we worked together at a church, and she got married and then pretty much got pregnant right away, which was not the plan. And I remember when she let me know because it was going to affect her job situation. And she talked about when she and her husband found out she was pregnant. And she said that she spent basically a whole day crying about it. Which for some of us, especially those of us who are pro-life, it might make you squirm a little bit. It might be like, oh, she was sad. Yes, she was sad. She wasn't sad about the idea of the baby. She was sad because there were a lot of plans that she and her husband had that were now going to be very different. There were going to be real losses that they were going to experience because this wasn't part of the plan. Now, the really neat thing about the story is she allowed herself the space to be able to grieve and to acknowledge children are inconvenient. This was going to change her life. There were going to be some losses that went along with that. And then she prayerfully embraced it. And she is an awesome mom. They are both awesome parents. They did not consider abortion in all of this. They simply acknowledged the reality that children are inconvenient. And as a father, I'll say, yeah, children are absolutely inconvenient. It's not hard for me to understand the idea of why people would be daunted at the idea of having a child. And at the same time, if we really are going to stand and say to the culture around us, children are not to be killed, children are to be treasured. And if you find out that you're pregnant, even in a surprising way, that child is worth you dropping what you're doing. And I'm talking to women as well as men, and making sure to care for that child. If that's the case, then that definitely impacts how we as believers need to act around our own children. How do we conduct ourselves? Do we treat our children as if they're an inconvenience to them? Are we farming them off constantly to childcare and to daycare so that we don't get interrupted in our careers? Do we treat them like distractions and frustrations from us doing what we believe is really important? Do we sneer at stay-at-home moms as not really contributing to society? All of these things are hugely important if we're going to live consistent with the idea that children are important enough that even when they are terribly inconvenient to us, they should be treasured. They should not be killed. They should not be set aside. They should be treasured. They should be embraced by us. The way that we act towards children when we're in public places and children are being kind of annoying and loud. When you're on an airplane and there's a child who's crying. When you're in a restaurant and there's a child who's distracting. When you're in church and there's a child who's crying. The ways that we respond in these situations say a lot about how much we really do value children. And I think one critique of us, or one thing that we can take away from this, is if we are going to be consistent with our pro-life values, that means that we are going to be pro-child, and that means that we are going to welcome children and be glad about their presence in situations when they're inconvenient to us personally because of their role in our lives, or inconvenient to us having adult interactions in public because children really are that valuable to us. Now, there's obviously a lot more that could be said about this subject. I'm just sort of taking one angle of it, the consistency angle. And once again, I just in summary say, I don't believe that there's any inconsistency with being pro-life when it comes to abortion and not necessarily being a pacifist or believing that any kind of act of killing is inherently immoral. I don't think that that's what Scripture teaches us, and I don't think that's a necessary accompaniment to the pro-life position. But I do think there are some things that we should lay out as far as our treatment of children, our attitude towards children, and over the value that human beings created in the image of God are of much more value than our own personal convenience. So if you have thoughts or questions or feedback or disagreements with this, I'd love to get to hear those. You can do that by just going to lbf.church, clicking on the little tab that says blog and podcast, and then leaving a comment on this article. You can do that with this and with other past LBF Church podcast episodes. I'd love to have interaction with you about those. I love the back and forth, and I love getting to hear thoughts because sometimes my view is sharpened, and also I think we're all sharpened by that kind of back and forth. And you can also just download the audio of the LBF Church podcast by subscribing there. Feel free to leave a review and a rating also, because that'll help us get the word out to more people as we look to help people grow in affection towards Jesus and grow more equipped to following him in the ways that he leads us. So thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.